Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight into the incredibly dramatic and frankly terrifying rise of the German Luftwaffe in 1939. We're going to look closely at exactly how this force was built out of thin air, the specific machines they used, and the revolutionary doctrine that literally changed modern warfare forever. Let's get right into it.
So, picture this. The war in the air actually kicked off before a single German soldier even crossed the Polish border. At exactly 4:26 in the morning, a formation of German Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers aggressively crossed into Polish airspace. Their target? The Diershaw Bridge on the Vistula River.
And that early morning strike brings us to a really chilling number, 19. This offensive action happened exactly 19 minutes before the official invasion began. It was the very first offensive move of the Second World War, and it set a brutal, lightning-fast pattern for everything that was about to follow. The Luftwaffe was instantly proving that they were the vital instrument making Blitzkrieg possible.
Now, to truly wrap our heads around this history, we have to talk about the sheer paradox of this military machine. By September 1939, it was the most modern, powerful air force on the planet. But, and this is a massive but, under the explicit terms of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, Germany was strictly forbidden from having any military aviation whatsoever. Officially, just 6 years prior to this invasion, the Luftwaffe simply did not exist. Zero.
So how on earth do you hide an entire air force? Well, they pulled off an incredible long-term campaign of deception. Back in the 1920s, they hid in plain sight. They developed a skilled pilot corps through what looked like secret civilian gliding clubs. Then, moving into the early 1930s, commercial airliners were secretly engineered so they could be rapidly converted into bombers, all while their pilots were out testing actual combat planes at secret Soviet bases under the Rapallo Treaty. Finally, on March 1, 1935, Hitler just threw off the disguise and brazenly announced the Luftwaffe to the whole world. The Western powers protested, sure, but they didn't actually do anything. And that inaction allowed Germany to deploy roughly 4,000 combat aircraft by 1939.
This almost unbelievable rapid expansion was driven by three vastly different guys. You had Hermann Göring, the commander-in-chief. He was a First World War flying ace, acting as the political figurehead. Now, he was increasingly addicted to morphine, but his early political clout is what secured them massive resources. Then you've got Erhard Milch. He was the former head of Lufthansa, and he brought this absolute organizational genius to the table, essentially building the factories and the massive supply chains. And finally, Ernst Udet. He was the procurement chief, charming, reckless, and passionately obsessed with the dive bomber. As we'll see, that specific obsession deeply and kind of dangerously shaped their entire future fleet.
Section 1. The Machines of Blitzkrieg. What the Luftwaffe actually had. By September 1939, this leadership trio had somehow produced a staggering inventory of aircraft. So let's break down the specific hardware that fueled their early devastating success. What's genuinely wild is the extreme contrast between their two most famous planes. On one hand, you have the blisteringly fast Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter, tearing through the sky at 570 kilometers per hour just to dominate the air. And right alongside it, you have the Ju-87 Stuka, which was remarkably slow, only hitting about 230 kilometers per hour. But speed wasn't the point. It served an entirely different purpose as a terrifyingly accurate dive bomber. Let's look a little closer at the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Powered by a Daimler-Benz engine cranking out over 1,000 horsepower, this thing easily outclassed its 1939 rivals in speed and climb rate. It was a beast. However, it had some pretty critical flaws hiding right there in plain sight. For one, the pilot had terrible rear visibility. On top of that, its landing gear was super narrow, making it incredibly accident-prone on the runway. They lost countless planes to crashes before they even saw combat. Plus, its fuel injection system severely limited its range, a flaw that would become disastrously apparent a bit later in the war.
Now on the flip side, the Ju-87 Stuka was angular, slow, and totally vulnerable, but it solved a massive problem for the era. You see, conventional level bombing in 1939 was incredibly inaccurate. Trying to hit a bridge or a moving tank from high altitude, basically impossible. The Stuka solved this by dropping payloads from insanely steep dives. We're talking up to 90 degrees in some variants. They'd release the bombs at a super low altitude for pinpoint accuracy. And of course, it had those infamous propeller-driven sirens. They served zero tactical purpose other than to inflict pure psychological terror on the people below. The screaming wail of a Stuka quickly became one of the most feared sounds in all of Europe.
Rounding out the fleet, you had the medium bombers. The Heinkel A-111 was a really capable strategic bomber, although that distinctive, fully glass nose gave it incredibly weak defensive firing fields. You also had the Dornier Do-17, affectionately nicknamed the Flying Pencil, acting as a tactical light bomber. And we absolutely can't forget the unglamorous but vital Junkers Ju-52. That was the slow, robust transport plane that just kept the logistics moving. But here is the kicker. What is glaringly absent from this entire lineup? The Luftwaffe possessed absolutely no four-engine heavy bombers. Not one.
Section 2. The Doctrine. The Luftwaffe's software. While the physical aircraft were obviously impressive, the true genius of the Luftwaffe wasn't just its hardware. It was their operational doctrine, this totally new approach to modern warfare that made them so unstoppable.
The absolute crucial point here is that the Luftwaffe didn't fight as an independent entity. They were built from the ground up around the concept of close air support. Through embedded liaison officers sitting right there with the Army and using advanced real-time radio communications, the Luftwaffe acted as the ultimate combined arms tool. A Panzer commander on the ground could literally radio an aircraft flying right above him, update targeting info on the fly, and have a devastating strike delivered in minutes. They were completely seamlessly integrated.
And this highlights a massive philosophical divide at the time. Consider this comparison. The British Royal Air Force organized themselves around the strategic bombing of industry and home defense. They were essentially bracing for a long, grueling war of attrition. Germany, on the other hand, built a purely tactical air force. Their single overriding goal was to secure rapid, decisive ground victories by directly supporting the Wehrmacht's advancing tanks and troops.
Section 3. The Combat Test. Poland, September 1939. This tactical doctrine didn't stay theoretical for very long. It faced its first massive, real-world crucible during the 4-week Polish campaign right at the start of the war.
Over those intense 4 weeks, the Luftwaffe executed a brutal 3-step cascading playbook. Step 1, contrary to the popular myth that the Polish Air Force was just destroyed on the tarmac, the Luftwaffe fiercely targeted airfields specifically to establish vital air superiority as fast as possible. Step 2, once they controlled the skies, the Stukas swooped in to provide immediate direct support to the advancing panzer divisions, obliterating enemy strong points in artillery. Step 3, the medium bombers pushed deeper, severing railways, taking out bridges, and destroying communications. This systematic disruption completely paralyzed the defense and ultimately led to the tragic defining bombing of Warsaw. It was basically a near-perfect confirmation of their terrifying new doctrine.
Section 4. The Autopsy. The Luftwaffe's fatal flaw. So by the end of 1939, thanks to the sheer shock and awe in Poland, they were undisputedly the most feared air force on the planet. But if we do an honest historical assessment, looking right past the propaganda, we actually see a deeply flawed foundation.
Let's talk numbers for a second. Despite Germany's massive initial inventory and their very real combat experience from both Spain and Poland, their industrial backend was struggling. When you look at the raw production data, Germany's industrial system in 1939 was actually churning out fewer aircraft than Britain's. They just did not have an industrial backbone capable of sustaining heavy, long-term losses.
So, weighing it all out, you've got this fascinating dichotomy. Their strengths, having real combat experience, superior fighter quality, and that unmatched close air support, absolutely guaranteed they were going to win short, fast campaigns. But look at the weaknesses column. Ernst Udet's absolute obsession with dive bombing meant they'd completely neglected to build any heavy bombers. Meanwhile, the Bf-109's short fuel range left them uniquely vulnerable in extended dogfights. And maybe worst of all, their early, massive successes bred a very dangerous, fatal overconfidence in their leadership, particularly with guys like Göring.
The biggest takeaway you need to grasp from all this is perfectly summed up right here. The Luftwaffe was a tactical air force trying to fight a strategic war. They built an incredibly specialized, razor-sharp tactical weapon that was precision-designed to win short campaigns in Western Europe. But without heavy bombers, without long-range fighters, and without maritime patrol aircraft, they were totally, fundamentally unsuited for a massive, multi-front, sustained world war.
Which leaves us with a really chilling historical irony to think about as we wrap up. The Germans built this magnificent force out of thin air, tested it and perfected it to execute blitzkrieg flawlessly. But we have to ask ourselves, what happens to a perfectly designed, short-war military machine when the war simply refuses to end? The very foundations that made the Luftwaffe look invincible in 1939 would ultimately ensure its complete destruction in the grueling years that followed. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring the history hidden within the data.